We this year are giving a conference which has an international perspective, and we are very pleased to have voices, obviously not due representation, but voices from Europe, Philippines, and Africa. And the first speaker is coming to us live from Norway. Knut Revstall, Reverend Knut is a district superintendent and a longtime friend, and we welcome you today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Don, and thanks for being invited to participate in this important conference. I've been asked to give a European perspective, and as you mentioned, I'm not able to speak on the behalf of the whole of Europe. The United Methodist Church in Europe is organized in 3 central conferences with a great variety in at least 2 of them. The Central and Southern Central Conference, consisting of 13 different countries, and the Northern Europe and Eurasia Central Conference, consisting of 10 different countries. The Germany Central Conference is probably more homogeneous, even if there are different opinions also there. The United Methodist Church is at a crossroads, and that's why we're here. Many United Methodists in Europe are considering our church future as it becomes increasingly harder also here to reconcile the theological differences, especially related to human sexuality. And across Europe, I think it's right to say that many people are anxious about the situation in the church, and to be honest, they have good reasons to worry. The annual conferences have responded in different ways to the decisions made at the called session of the General Conference in 2019, some with affirmation, some with acceptance, and some with dissatisfaction and frustration. Mindful of the diversity in the Nordic and Baltic Episcopal area, which I belong to, and the divisive potential of our perspectives regarding the understanding of human sexuality and of how we can best be in ministry with all people, our bishop has initiated a roundtable process with the intention to bring together influencers from each of the 7 conferences in the area, seeking a foundation for the future of the Episcopal area that includes as much unity and as much missional strength as possible. The roundtable has met twice, and each meeting has revealed a strong desire of many to find ways to remain together. We are all small conferences, and we've been together for a long time. But there are also strong voices expressing a need to separate, and that is something new in our Episcopal area. Because the roundtable conversations have been challenging and demanding. Many of us left the last gathering in February this year with a heavy heart, pondering the depth of the gap that exists between different theological positions, and even more between the consequences those positions lead to for our present and future relationship. My own annual conference, Norway, is a progressive one when it comes to human sexuality. For many years, marriage between people of the same gender has been allowed in the country, and the majority church, the Lutheran Church, also changed their view on marriage a couple of years ago. Keeping a conservative view on these issues is considered to be quite outdated by the public. We had our last annual conference in June 2019. At that time, the whole church taught that at the 2020 General Conference, the traditional plan would be implemented. A large majority of the annual conference opposed this, and we stated that we are experiencing unrest, great disagreement, and the danger of division following the extraordinary General Conference decision. We recognize that a clear majority in Norway has a different position than what the called session of the General Conference 2019 adopted, and that we want to move towards becoming a church with a fully inclusive view of human sexuality. A task force was established in order to investigate what it takes for the United Methodist Church in Norway to be able to live with a fully inclusive view of human sexuality. And that included also to consider the possibility of leaving the United Methodist Church, if that was the option and the solution to be able to live into our preferred future. Today, as we have heard already, the situation is different. The traditional plan will not be implemented at the next General Conference. More likely, the church will be divided, at least in the US part of the church. And that might not be a tragedy for the church in the US. It is quite different for small churches in Norway and the rest of Europe. Splitting the United Methodist Church annual conferences here into 2 or even more parts would be quite damaging. But at least from a Norwegian point of view, I believe, I hope and pray, and I believe, and I'm quite certain that United Methodists in Norway will be able to live into a future together where we, as we have done in the past, respectfully give each other enough space to engage in God's mission in our diverse contexts, and that we will be part of a global United Methodist Church. I don't think that all annual conferences, either in our Episcopal area or in the rest of Europe, will share that position. But I am certain that a large group of United Methodists in Europe will follow my thinking on this, and that the relationship to the United Methodist Church is so important. And just to mention one last thing, several have mentioned the possibility of developing our relationship with the Methodist Church in Britain and Ireland. Over the past years, we have been involved in efforts to strengthen what we call the European Methodist Council. The member churches have signed a formal agreement and strengthened the organizational setup, and the relationships are certainly developing. The European bishops agreed that we need to know which countries and how many churches and members the post-separation United Methodist Church is composed of before we can consider developing our relationships with other denominations further. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. It's a privilege to have you, and if people have questions, they can send them, and if we get a chance, we'll invite you back in to answer them. I think you've given us important insight into the difference between the United States and Europe and all of the conferences. This is knowledge and insight that we lack, many of us, and we do not think about what it means for a small church to be divided, for example, such as the one in Norway. We are now going to turn to Rwanda, where a very brave and courageous leader of our church is going to speak to us by video. Augustine Bahati is a person I work with quite regularly, who wants to give us a different perspective, and we're going to share that video with you at this time.
Thank you very much. I'm Bahati Augustine, treasurer of EMC Rwanda Provisional Conference. Ladies and gentlemen, our warm greetings to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, the pro and the cons around sexuality and Christianity are among the most divisive problems facing our churches, particularly in the United Methodist Church around the world. Many, but not all African countries, homosexuality is against the law, culture, and in the few, you can get the day for being homosexual. Some African political and church leaders treat gays and as pigs and dogs and frogs, Robert Mugabe's speech. But not every African mistreat LGBTQI person. They are caring Christians who believes in the dignity, worthy, and equality of persons. Please do not forget they are good people in Africa seeking to improve life for all our citizens. Pray and support those followers of Jesus who believe the biblical teaching of Jesus that are to love God and our neighbors as we love ourselves. The difference in interpretations of the Bible are stumbling block due to the fact humans interpret the Bible to suit their own schedule. When human being hyperlink sexuality to scripture, it becomes unstable ground and it prohibits even human being from meeting other people and learning from them. The challenge for us in the course of this time is to show grace and respect to others and to enjoy the gift of our sexual orientation without hurting other people. Ladies, gentlemen, LGBTQI people's friends, the problem that LGBT people face in the church make them irritate at God and the church because of the church teachings. People do not learn of God's love for all people. They do not hear even the good news that all people are made in God's image. Church leaders, in other hand, might be angry because they need to address unanticipated problems of sexual and gender minorities. In addition to that, the clergies in the church all about being at war with the church leadership. They avoid intervening even where needed and fail to protect minorities. Hence, we are seeing around LGBTQI people suffering. Many good Christians, African wish to be inclusive through motivating partnership among LGBTQI organizations and the church in many ways. Be an inclusive church that makes a speciality of spirituality of Jesus' love for all people. Talk, encourage, and help mothers and their fathers who have LGBTQI children in their families. So, work out unconditional love, inclusive love, as Jesus has for us. Ladies and gentlemen, to be a role model, we decided to set up an inclusive organization called Inclusive Mission for Health and Hope, made up by gays, pro-LGBTQI, and HIV positive. With various support from the center, we take care for all, but with a strong focus on marginalized and minorities, where include LGBTQI and HIV positive people. In these regards, please help me to thank the Center for Health and Hope for staying close to us in this struggle for social welfare of LGBTQI and HIV positive people here around. We are grateful to have partners in this liberation movement that apprehends the value of addressing the spiritual desires of LGBT people. However, If being homosexual was a choice, hardly anyone would want to be gay, especially in Africa. Being an homosexual means your life is very, very difficult, and you have to endure much meanness and stigma even around from the churches. Consequently, it is not a preference but a God-given orientation. LGBTQI people and their friends are among the most courageous and compassionate people in the world. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell every gay man and woman, you are never an abomination to God or humiliation on your family or society. If you are infected with HIV or have another physical or mental challenges, it is most true not God's punishment for being gay. Please, God loves you. Fighting HIV stigma, religious violence, and homophobia is our goal. Thank you for your high attention.
Thank you, Bahati, for that powerful message. Bahati is with us on the webinar, but he provided the video because sometimes connections do not come through clearly from Rwanda. So he is participating, and any questions that you might address in the question and answer part, we'll get to him as either today or later. We now turn to the Philippines, where we are privileged to have Bishop Juan, who is the president of the Council of Bishops of the Philippines, a good friend and articulate spokesperson who's particularly going to share with us more about this Christmas covenant that for many of us we're still learning about. We're grateful to have a third bishop on the program, and this one from the Central Conference, Bishop Juan, by video.
This is the day that the Lord has made. Dear friends from the United Methodist Association of Retired Clergy, I greet you all in the name of Christ from the Philippines Central Conference. I especially would like to express my gratitude to my dear friend Dr. Don Messer for your invitation for me to take part in this webinar for inclusiveness. Oh, I'm so thankful that you invited a Central Conference servant leader like me to be part of this. I would like to affirm at the outset that we are together in our passion, in our effort to build a world that works for all. And this is indeed our desire to be an inclusive community. Friends, I want to inform you that the Christmas covenant is close to our hearts from the Central Conferences. This was passed by the Philippines Annual Conference Cavite in the beautiful mountain city, the Tagaytay City, at the Tagaytay Mission Camp last February. I was there. Bishop Seri Francisco was there. Bishop Vittorio was there. And our friends from the United States, including my friend Dr. Mark Holland, Karen Prudente, and other friends who are pushing for inclusiveness. I want to inform you that we promote connectional relationships rooted in mission. what I want to say is, from the Philippines, we want to collaborate with you and in the whole connection to work for missions. But of course, in so doing, we would like to respect our contextual ministry settings. The Philippine context, the African context, the European context, and we would like to say that we respect you in the United States. And we want to do missions in the light of this respect for ministry, doing ministry together. But of course, I would like to just share this with you. You know, God created the world so nice, so well, but still, you know, daytime in the United States is nighttime here in the Philippines. So during our first virtual Council of Bishops meeting, you know what? In the United States, it's 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. But we here in the Philippines is 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So that means that even our old retired bishops are awake at night. Even myself, in my travels, I have to stop at night and join our Council of Bishops. What am I saying is, even my dear friends, in these many challenges of our diversities, we can still work together in unity. And we can work together even in legislations for the good of our worldwide global connectional ministry. Now let me go into some specifics. What is unique here in the Philippines in promoting this Christmas covenant? In the midst of our diversities, I say again, there's unity and there's connectedness. One unique practice here in the Philippines is the bayanihan. Friends, bayanihan is a cherished ancient Filipino concept of community spirit and cooperation amongst our people. And that is with a goal to achieve our future, a future full of hope, girded and with a common denominator called unity, love, support for each other. Bayanihan is rooted in the word bayan, which means a nation or a community. And bayanihan is, expressed through concrete community support for families that need to be relocated. Just conceptualize this. When a family needs to be relocated together with their house, a small, nipa house, able-bodied persons will, put a long bamboo on this small house, and they carry, and that's again balikatan, shoulder to shoulder. They carry that house from one place to another. And this is a beautiful expression, a beautiful picture of being united, helping each other, my dear friends. So this small bamboo house could be transferred from one place to another, especially when there's a calamity. There's a typhoon, there's a storm, or even floods. They, my dear friends, could help that family. In this practice, we celebrate beautiful principles of unity, and that is rooted in our concept of what community is all about. Radical hospitality, generosity, of course. Wonderful. This is uniquely Filipino, and of course Asian. Other Asians also do this. Now, what I would like to request, my dear friends, especially amongst you retired clergy of the United Methodist Church, is for us to pray for one another. We Filipinos continue to pray for you. Let's pray for one another, and let's pray for the General Conference. Indeed, I'm really praying that this Christmas covenant with a central conference concept will be passed in the General Conference, and that we will be able to create regional United Methodist conferences, so that we, in our respect for our contextual realities, we could work together, my dear friends. Bayanihan, balikatan, helping one another. These are beautiful Filipino cherished principles. Congratulations. God bless us all. Amen.
God bless you, Bishop Juan, and our siblings in the Philippines and around the world for those presentations. I've been asked how many people are watching. I actually do not know, except I know that over 250 some people have signed in. I just don't know how many people are watching at each particular place. But you can see that we do have a great deal of interest across some 40 states and 5 countries at least today. And this recording will be available on umark.org as soon as we can make it available, and you can use it for study groups in your church. You can refer back to it. This is an opportunity to hear voices that we normally don't hear and to absorb information that we have not had before. At this point, I'm very pleased that we have a bright young theologian who is providing us great information and insight globally, a mission theologian with the General Board of Global Ministries and a blog master of the website and Global. I welcome at this time Dr. David Scott to share with us this global perspective.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I want to thank the conference organizers even more for inviting those individuals from outside the United States from whom we have just heard. I'll be glad if you learn something from what I say this morning, but everything I say is intended to amplify the voices of those in the United Methodist Church from outside the US. Most of what I will share is gleaned from my own practice of listening to those voices, and much of what I say is an invitation to join me in that practice of listening. And I'll try to speak concisely enough that we have some time for you to ask not just me, but also Knut Refsdal and Vahadi Augustine some questions at the end. So I hope to offer you 3 things this morning, or afternoon as it may be where you are. A caution as we enter the practice of listening to voices outside our own contexts, an analysis of some of what I have heard from those voices about the current state of the United Methodist Church, and a moral reminder as United Methodist voices from around the world engage in discussions about the future of the United Methodist Church. Let me start with a caution, and to get there, I want to begin by asking you to reflect for a moment. So the United States has just completed an election, so many of us in the United States and a number of interested onlookers from around the world have been thinking about US politics recently. So take a moment and think about what word or 2 words you might use to describe US politics right now. Now, I can't ask for a show of hands, but my guess is that many of you, especially those of us from the United States, chose words like divided, polarized, conflicted, perhaps even toxic. I want to do another thought experiment, and this will be especially for viewers from the United States. I want you to think about whether you could guess someone's political preferences based on the following pieces of information, and assume each piece of information is about a different person. So what would you guess about a person's political affiliation if you knew they lived in a rural area? What about if they were Black? What about if you knew they were a coal miner? What if you knew that they were a devout Catholic? What if you knew that they liked kale? What if you knew that they drove a pickup truck? What if you knew that they shopped at Walmart? What if you knew that they liked to drink wine? So wine drinking is not an inherently political act in the present day United States. This is not tea drinking in revolutionary US, where there was implications to tax politics and authority of the British government. But within the contemporary United States, a lot of apolitical behavior has taken on political overtones. And that's because, as scholar Liliana Mason and others have shown, there's been an increasing tendency over the past half century of US politics for the various aspects of one's identity to align with their political persuasion. There's a process called social sorting. Because of the extent of social sorting, we often extrapolate based on limited information, like what sort of vehicle one drives or perhaps doesn't drive, or their food and drink preferences, to make assumptions about their political preferences. Or we may know one political opinion that a person holds and assume that their other political opinions will align with that one opinion. For those watching from outside the United States, there are different ways in your own context of assessing someone's politics without asking them directly, or different ways in which various aspects of identity align, though that'll be different from the questions I asked a minute ago. So in other words, we all use mental heuristics or shortcuts in our thinking to sort people into different categories, and liberal and conservative, or progressive and traditionalist are important labels for some of the most socially salient categories in the United States right now. These heuristics are not right all of the time. We can perhaps think of kale-eating conservatives and liberals who drive pickup trucks, but they're right enough of the time for them to be useful tools to save us cognitive energy. And we're really good at applying these heuristics to the people we encounter in our lives. Some people might call these ways of making decisions or sorting people stereotypes, and that's not wrong. But we also have the sense, I think, that stereotypes are bad, which is why I use the term heuristics. All people everywhere use heuristics. They're necessary to making it through life. If it takes you 5 minutes to figure out if that bear is really a bear, then you're lunch. Or if it takes you 20 minutes to figure out if that table is really a table, then you're late for lunch. So making assumptions using heuristics is part of how we as humans stay safe and how we navigate the world in a reasonably efficient way. So just as we use heuristics to sort people into political categories, we have similar, although not entirely the same, heuristics about people we encounter in church. Though, as Mark Holland was saying earlier, there's a lot of overlap between the sorts of heuristics we use in the United States to sort people politically and the heuristics we use to sort people in terms of theological positions. So we take small pieces of information about somebody's religiosity. Do they attend a megachurch? Do they talk about systemic oppression? What's their favorite Bible verse? Do they tell the story of being saved? And we extrapolate based on those pieces of information to make assumptions about what the rest of their theological views are. Again, we're not right all of the time, but we're right often enough to rely heavily on such heuristics and to use them frequently when we encounter other United Methodists from our country whom we don't know. You could probably meet a United Methodist you did not previously know from your own country, and within 3 questions have a guess about their stance. If you're from the United States, have a guess about their stance on queer inclusion, even if you didn't ask about that issue directly. So this finally brings me to my caution. The heuristics we in the United States use to categorize other folks from the United States or other United Methodists from the United States break down quickly outside of the United States. And the same is true for those of listeners from other countries. The heuristics you use in your own context break down in other contexts. The elements of identity and belief that overlap in the United States do not overlap in the same ways in other contexts. Therefore, the assumptions that we make about people's views on any particular issue based off their views on another issue are much less likely to be correct when we're interacting internationally and across cultures. To use an analogy, if you're used to categorizing everything as a duck or a rabbit, you're probably going to make a mistake when you first encounter a platypus, let alone one of those optical illusion pictures that is both a duck and a rabbit. Thus, you as Americans might think of Western Europeans as being progressive in the same sense that they think of US American theological progressivism. And there are indeed many similarities, especially when it comes to things like use of historical critical biblical methods and the attitude towards queer inclusion. But I've also heard Western Europeans express frustrations with US progressives for not talking more about soteriology, which these Western Europeans saw as a very important theological topic, but which is not really a progressive theological preoccupation in the United States. Alternatively, I know African United Methodists who would qualify as traditionalists in the sense of having a high view of Scripture, a greater sense of supernatural intervention in this world, and an opposition to queer inclusion, but are perhaps more progressive than progressives from the United States when it comes to analyzing the unjust nature of global capitalism. And while we in the United States tend to think about social division as between Republicans and Democrats and church division as being about conflicts over gay ordination and gay marriage, division in society and in the church means something very different in different places. So when I say that there was a divisive election recently that the church is urging for calm and avoiding violence in the wake of, well, that applies to the United States, but also applies to Côte d'Ivoire. Or when I say that this deep conflict in the church that's been lasting for decades and has surfaced questions about ownership and control of church properties, well, that applies to the United States, but that also applies to Nigeria. There are other places in the world where the UMC is or has been just as deeply divided as it currently is in the United States, and other societies in the world that are just as, if not more so, deeply divided as in the United States. But those divisions in different countries do not map neatly onto each other. And so people from other countries don't easily fit into the categories that we have from our home country used to describe divisions. And the divisions that we consider most important in our home context are often not the divisions that other people consider most important in their home context. So I invite you to spend more time listening to United Methodist and other voices from outside the United States or outside your home country. But to make that a productive process, we need to practice setting aside the heuristics that we use within our home country. In other words, we need to learn to be able to see platypuses and not assume that everything is a duck or a rabbit. This takes practice and it takes constantly checking one's assumptions. So I want to use that setting aside of our heuristics and our sense of what the divisions in the church are to offer an analysis of global United Methodism as it looks to the future, starting with Africa, but then eventually getting to the Philippines and Europe as well. African United Methodists have emerged as a significant group within the United Methodist Church over the past couple of decades, accounting for about 1/3 of General Conference delegates and over 40% of members. US commentators recognize the importance of African United Methodists, but often fall into the mistake of trying to use US heuristics to understand African United Methodists. Thus, some will say, well, most Africans are opposed to queer inclusion, so they must be traditionalists, extrapolating from that one view to try to put Africans into a familiar category. Others will say, but Africans really value the institutions of the United Methodist Church, so they must really be centrists. Again, extrapolating from one view to put Africans into a familiar category. I'm here to suggest to you that both takes are wrong. We in the United States are used to sorting the world into ducks and rabbits, but Africans are platypuses. And unless we in the United States can break out of our own categories and until we come to understand Africans on their own terms, we will fundamentally fail to understand them, their theology, and their hopes and goals for the church. Part of this process of understanding African United Methodists on their own terms is understanding what is generally true of African leaders, and part of it is understanding the many divisions and conflicts that exist within African United Methodism that will have their own impacts on the future of the church as variables independent from the divisions within the United States or other parts of the world. Let me start by talking a bit more about those divisions. Although it's easy for people in the United States to think about African United Methodists as a single block, that's far from true. First, there are the linguistic and national differences within Africa. African United Methodists speak dozens of different languages and 4 different lingua francas, only one of which is English. The UMC operates in over 20 different countries, each with their own social, cultural, legal, and religious frameworks that give each national unit of the UMC in Africa a unique set of concerns. Thus, most African United Methodism is local United Methodism, that is concerned with concerns within that local context, as is, I think, true of United Methodism in all places. Moreover, for a variety of reasons, travel within Africa is often more difficult than traveling from Africa to Europe or even the United States. So it is not always easy for people to come together from different countries within Africa. And when Africans do come together, there is again the linguistic barrier and the need for translation, which inhibits networking. So within that diversity that exists across the African continent, there are a limited set of groups of Africans that are networked and capable of shaping an African voice that extends beyond local concerns and engages with some of the external currents within the denomination. The bishops are a primary group. Since they meet and discuss frequently, though there are tensions within the Africa College of Bishops around issues of gender, personality, and other matters. There are those connected through education, either through having met at Africa University, which brings together students from across the continent, or by serving as school administrators and being linked through GBHEM's quite good network within Africa. There are those linked through missionary service or other connections to global ministries, or occasionally other boards, which bring people together from across the continent. There are those linked through serving on denominational boards or committees, which often brings them into context not only with other Africans, but also with people from elsewhere in the denomination too. Although again, language and culture can limit the sort of networks formed there. And there are those linked through the Africa Initiative and other US traditionalist funded networking efforts. So these 5 groups are not mutually exclusive, but they play a significant role in shaping African United Methodists' views on the future of the UMC beyond the local sphere and in relation to the rest of the connection. One thing that is true in most places in Africa is that the United Methodist Church is a strong brand. So people talk about the United States becoming a post-denominational society. That's not true as much in Africa or the Philippines or Europe, for that matter. The United Methodist Church as a brand identity, if you will forgive that commercial parallel, is strong and important. The church in many places is well known for its social service and engagement with civil society. And although there are legitimate concerns about the cross and flame symbol within the US context, in Africa, it's a simple and easily recognized logo that adds to the brand value of the United Methodist Church. Moreover, in almost all countries in which the UMC exists in Africa, there are other forms of Methodism, whether that's Free Methodist or descendants of British Methodist Mission or AME Zion. So being United Methodist is an important and valuable distinction among denominations. So many Africans who are engaged in the denomination beyond the local setting want to continue in the United Methodist Church and continue it as it is because it facilitates their networking, supports their influence within their local setting, and continues a brand that is valuable within that local setting. However, while Africans are not all opposed to LGBTQ rights, as we heard earlier, Africa as a whole is one of the most conservative areas of the world on issues related to queer rights. So most Africans do not want the UMC brand to become associated with queer inclusion in the minds of their fellow citizens, since they think that would hurt the brand and the work that the church does. And this is true whether or not they personally find queer exclusion to be an important issue. And there's a range of senses among the Africans I've talked to about whether that's really an important issue for the church to speak up on. But as you have heard from Augustine Bahati, the Wesleyan emphasis on God's love for all people, including minorities and the marginalized, is also an important part of the United Methodist brand. That emphasis on sharing God's love with the marginalized, in some cases, does extend to LGBTQI persons, but also includes survivors of rape, ethnic minorities, the HIV positive, prostitutes, the displaced, refugees, and others. Work for justice and care for the marginalized is an important part of the UMC in Africa. Therefore, Africans are a platypus when it comes to UMC politics, at least from the perspective of the United States. By and large, they want to continue in the UMC. They are resistant to queer inclusion, but also pro-social justice. Of course, from an African perspective, it's probably those of us in the United States that are platypuses or wombats or aye-ayes or some other sort of unusual animal. Seeing African views as a distinct position separate from US traditionalists and US centrists and progressives leads to seeing the denomination as caught not in a two-way divide, but as in a three-way standoff. So US traditionalists and Africans want to keep Book of Discipline prohibitions against gay marriage and queer ordination. US centrists and progressives do not. US centrists and Africans want to keep the infrastructure of the denomination. US traditionalists do not. US traditionalists and US centrists want to find an amicable way to separate. Africans may not, if that prevents them from realizing their other two objectives. And the African bishops have recently indicated that they see the protocol in its current form as undercutting those objectives and have expressed an interest in renegotiating the protocol. So each of these groups, if well disciplined in their voting, might be able to prevent the other groups from realizing their objectives. US traditionalists are trying to make headway within Africa by using the Africa Initiative and other networks that they've helped create, and by exploiting internal divisions within local contexts to try to identify Africans who might be interested in joining a new traditionalist denomination. The traditionalists seem very intent upon having their new denomination be global, I think because it serves rhetorically to support the sense that they have of the righteousness of their cause. But this seeking African alliances has the effect of undermining the bishops who are not happy about this sort of interference, as they would call it, and it has the risk of stirring up and exacerbating internal conflicts that US traditionalists often do not fully understand and may really not be interested in doing so. Approaches to the issue of queer inclusion, turning now to the Philippines and Europe, approaches to the issue of queer inclusion differ there. In both contexts, there are significant groups in the pro-inclusion camp and significant groups in the anti-inclusion camp. In Europe, that tends to be a distinction between Western and Eastern Europe, as you've heard Knut Refsdal talk a little bit about, and there's variation within the Philippines itself. But in both contexts, though for different reasons, the unity of the church is really important. And seen as critical for the church to be able to carry out its life-saving ministries of service and justice, and really to continue as the church. And I think you heard that both in Knut Refsdal's remarks and in Bishop Juan's remarks. So the unity of the church is important, although not in a way that's necessarily opposed to or played off of justice. And justice tends to be important, although not in a way that's played off of or opposed to evangelism, as we tend to construct those binaries in the United States. There is a reason why the Christmas Covenant has come out of the Philippines. I should also say, too, that both in Europe and in the Philippines, there's a very long history of a century or more of thinking about their relationship to and their place in an international denomination. So there's good reasons why the Christmas Covenant comes out of a Filipino context and has strong backing from Europe, along with support from leaders from Africa as well. It reflects a desire for unity for the sake of ministries of justice and service, and a desire for contextuality that's based on all of this reflection on colonialism and the place of countries outside the United States within the denomination. Moreover, this is one of the first major pieces of legislation. The Christmas Covenant is one of the first major pieces of legislation in the UMC to ever come from outside the United States. And I think that makes it a really significant piece of legislation that deserves consideration just for that reason. It is, however, significant that Tom Lambrecht of Good News just this week wrote a piece opposing the Christmas Covenant, as casting it as a path towards queer inclusion, even in a denomination that traditionalists intend to leave. Lambrecht does not acknowledge the expressly stated anti-colonialist aims of the Christmas Covenant, and instead just reads it through the lens of US church conflict. Finally, I want to, so there are a lot of issues, different issues around and different considerations around the world for thinking about the future of the United Methodist Church. And I want to leave you with this moral reminder: as people from around the world are considering the future of the United Methodist Church, I hope we will all remember this moral statement: Black African lives matter. In the United States and around the world, this year has seen a surge of protests against systemic racism, and that movement towards justice has been one of the few positive developments in what seems at other times like an otherwise unrelentingly negative year. And in response to those movements, the United Methodist Church has committed itself to helping dismantle racism. But I am convinced that we must recognize the global nature of racism. We cannot make progress in the treatment of Black people in the United States if we continue to perpetuate anti-Black stereotypes and anti-Black views of Black people in Africa or elsewhere in the diaspora. Therefore, we as a denomination need to care about Black African lives, Black African voices, Black African development and well-being. Decisions made by the United Methodists about the future of the denomination will have real impacts on the lives of Black Africans. The United Methodist Church is critically involved in many places in Africa in peacemaking, medical work, gender rights advocacy, food provision, and other forms of ministry that directly impact Black African lives, whether Black Africans live and die, and the quality of their lives if they do live. There are legitimate debates to be had about how such vital ministries should be funded and how they can best be supported by those of us from outside the continent, but we cannot say that such ministries are unimportant. We have to recognize that Black African lives matter, and programs to support those lives do too. As a denomination, we need to say no to queer suicide from oppressive theology, no to the killing of Black people by the police in the United States, no to extrajudicial killings by the police in the Philippines, and no to Black Africans dying from wars fought with US-made guns or from underdevelopment because the global economy has robbed their countries. I cannot tell you what exactly that should mean for the future of the denomination, because that's far beyond me as a mere individual to say. This is something that we must discern together in conversation with one another. But whatever future we develop as the United Methodist Church must be based on the recognition that Black lives matter in the United States, in Africa, and around the world. And it must be based on a practice of learning to listen to one another, listen across context, to set aside our presuppositions about where other people are, and to opening ourselves up to the work of God, the image of God in one another. So may it be. Amen.
Wow, I think that's a feeling that many people have listening to your presentation. You've pushed our intellectual boundaries and hopefully broadened our empathy as well. I have noted in the chat box a request for written copies of your speech, thinking that that might be available. Maybe it's going to appear in your blog. You also have something in the question and answer, David, that you might like to look at and respond to as we move forward. I would remind everyone that they can go back to this session as well as all the other sessions ahead of us and that we've already heard this morning by looking on the website of umark.org. At this point, I am honored to present to you a young colleague in our conference, and ask Jasper Peters, who is pastor of Belong Church and leader of our delegation to General Conference, to share. Jasper?
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Messer. Thank you, David Scott. Thank you for allowing us to bathe and absorb our own lack of perspective and ability to grow and understand those who we would call siblings in Christ. I'm grateful to be among you. I'm sorry that I can't see all of you, and that makes it especially presumptuous of me to make an assumption about you. But I'm going to assume that you have the ability to put things in proper perspective, especially knowing that there are many retired colleagues among us, that you have the ability to put time in particular perspective. And with that in mind, I want to share with you some recent history coming from our neck of the woods in Methodism. There was a group of Black people, Black Americans, Black Coloradans, in fact, who had been gathering, who had been studying the scriptures, and who desired to be in greater fellowship. They appealed to our to our bishop and conference that they might be sent someone to aid in their study and the pursuit of their faith. And the reply from the conference was that I can't believe my cat has left me alone all day and now would like to be a part of the conversation. The reply from the conference was that they were too busy and that this group should furnish themselves. And before anyone should dare criticize my bishop, Bishop Karen Alavito, let me say that this was under a different bishop, under a different structure. This was in the 1860s. And before you call me a liar for naming that as recent history, I would ask you to tell me specifically the ways in which things have substantively changed. Let me tell you more about what happened in 1860. The conference decided that this group wasn't worthy of their attention, and they decided that their internal conflict and concerns were of greater importance in that moment. And I get it, there was a lot going on. They were a few years on the far side of a church schism, and yet their country was on the brink of war. There were tons of things for them to be anxious and consumed with, and so they missed this opportunity for ministry because of what had obscured their vision otherwise. I would ask to the many bishops who are among us, to the pastors who are among us, what would you do if a group of people came to you, a group of Black people came to a group of Black house churches, appealed to us, let us be among you? What would we do? How would we feel if a group of queer identified Christians asked that someone be appointed to them? I can only imagine how quickly our bishop would fly to respond. And yet these folks, they missed the opportunity for ministry because they were distracted with the other things that are going on. The mountain sky perspective now, in this moment, and acknowledging all the things that have changed, and it changed since 1 year ago when I was with you. In that moment, we thought that we would be done with this chapter by now. We had thought we would be done with so many things. We didn't know to anticipate so many of the things that have come, but we certainly thought that we would be done with the work of the General Conference, that we would have taken a large and significant and important step, even if a painful one, toward the work of greater inclusion. The reality is that that work that we thought would be ours through the course of the 2020 General Conference is no longer before us. In fact, the General Conference of 2020 is not and will not ever be before us. That's not a meeting that we get to go to anymore, because what we thought of this past period of 10 or more months, this period of change and transformation, what we thought of as something that we could simply survive has turned out to be something through which we are becoming. I'm not going to preach to this room about Exodus. I trust you to make the connections. We thought that we were simply going to survive, but in fact we have to become. And part of who we have become and what we have become in this time is not only a people who are committed to the inclusion of LGBTQI people, not only a people who are committed to the greater inclusivity of the church as a whole, but we are also a people who can finally speak to the racism, to the white supremacy, to the exclusion that has been baked in to this church for far too long. And it is not by any means that we are excluding or ignoring, lest we forget our lesson about heuristics that we have just learned. But it is not the case that we are ignoring or forgetting or setting aside the matters of LGBTQ inclusion. No. What we are doing is also acknowledging the brokenness of our systems, of our implicit biases, of our churches, of our organizations. We are acknowledging that same brokenness that is currently impacting so many LGBTQI people has also been impacting people of African descent. And should you somehow make the categorical or heuristic mistake of assuming that we can only speak about the interests of Black people or queer people independently, may I remind you that there are plenty of Black queer people in the world and among us as well. Even if we aren't talking about people who share multiple identities, what we can acknowledge, and the lesson that I think 2020 has brought to us, if 1860 didn't do it well enough, is that my freedom is wrapped up in your freedom, and your freedom is wrapped up in my freedom. And we don't have to pursue freedom independently or in a particular order. We can seek the freedom and liberation of our church. We can seek for our church to be better than it was. We can seek that our church not just simply survive something, that our church become something. something new, something fit for this time and this age. And so I would simply offer up that that is what Mountain Sky is up to. We are no longer working to survive this time, but we are leaning into what it means to become. And I would offer as proof of that there are very few of the very predictable arguments, debates, discussions, the things that we sometimes mask as holy conferencing, but isn't deserving of that title. We aren't doing a whole lot of that right now. We're not engaging a lot of our energy in that right now. The best news that I have found in 2020 is that the church is really, really busy being the church. Understanding what it means to be United Methodist in our local context and committed to being good stewards of our local context, to taking care of our people who are facing eviction, to taking care of our people who don't have enough food, to taking care of our people who feel lost without community, and that an online experience isn't doing it, and we can't be safe and treat our neighbors well by gathering in person and living in the midst of this tension. The church is about that work today. And is about that work right now. And our prayer is that we can allow what we are becoming, allow the transformation that we're experiencing now to help dictate and influence the work of the General Conference. In other words, we thought the General Conference might tell us who we're going to be, and instead, we are close to the ground waiting for the Holy Spirit to tell us who we're becoming, so that we might tell the General Conference, this is who God has called us to be, and this is how God has called us to be together. And so that is the work that is before us, and that is the work that continues. We continue to be in dialogue with our friends and colleagues and neighbors throughout our vast and diverse conference. We continue to be in dialogue and partnership, and beginning to build and plan and think with our colleagues across the West and beyond. Again, not just to figure out how we can survive whatever the coming storm, so to speak, is. If you aren't not yet aware, a storm has arrived, and not only are we surviving, but we're being transformed. And so I'm encouraged by the work that is before us, and whether or when we get to the work of the General Conference, I understand our work truly to be the work that is committed to the becoming of the church, and I'm grateful to be a part of that and among that with you. I'm grateful for all of my colleagues from Mountain Sky, for the first elects from the Western jurisdiction, from the team of 10, and I'm not just name dropping in an obligatory sense. These are the people who I'm working with and speaking with and hearing from on a regular basis about how we can be prepared for this moment and the moments that are to come. And so I am, though I thought I would be done by now with this particular work of the General Conference, I'm grateful that the work of the church isn't done, and that the church isn't done with us. So I thank you for your time and the opportunity to be with you.
Jasper, we, the retired clergy, are so proud to have great new leaders like you speaking on our behalf and working in the church. And we're grateful for all of those who have spoken to us this morning. I'm really proud to be a United Methodist, really proud as I think of my colleagues around the world who are seeking to do justice and love mercy.